A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. Well, tonight is going to be our last discussion of the first insight, which is waking up from our sleepwalking, from my book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety. And what I want to focus on tonight is Dr. Karen Horney's idea or ideas about how we resolve our inner conflicts and what she called our basic anxiety. You see, every person wants to create a sense of safety in their life. And of course, how do we feel safe? Well, it's by being loved, by being accepted and belonging. That's what creates and generates that feeling of safety we have. And for a lot of different reasons, and there's a lot of forces that are impinging on us as we're developing, we go through a period where we start to be very concerned about, whether we're going to be loved, whether we're going to be accepted, and whether we're going to belong. And those concerns generate this anxiety. Now, I know if you're a human being, you've experienced anxiety in your life. Every one of us have or has. Sometimes it's so severe that we have a panic attack. Other times it's not as severe. It's a low-grade anxiety. Sometimes it's higher than that. But the one thing that I think we all know is that it's a terrible feeling. I'd much rather be depressed than anxious. There's no question in my mind about it. I don't like anxiety. And so when we feel anxious, we are so motivated to try to find some way to resolve that anxiety, to find peace of mind, to find some equanimity, some quietness of mind, calmness of heart. That's what we all want. And so at a very, very early age, we come up with a plan. And this idea is, I called it in the book, a blueprint. It's a blueprint that we start laying down about who we have to become to ensure that we're going to be loved, that we're going to be accepted, and we're going to belong. Now, Dr. Karen Horney is a prolific writer, or she was a prolific writer. She's left us a lot of great books. The last work she did was called Neurosis and Human Growth. And it's a very technical book. It's really written for a professional level, not for the lay public, but you could pick it up and try to read it. You might find it accessible. It takes me many, many reads to get through it in terms of even a chapter and so, because it's so dense and she's so brilliant. But what she said is that typically we take three different paths. And early on in her career, she described them as what we move towards, what we move against, and what we move away from. Later on, she described these as the appeal of love, which is moving towards, the appeal of mastery, which is moving against, and the appeal of freedom, which is moving away from. She described them differently in her last book. Instead of moving towards, she called that the self-effacing solution, because the appeal of love means I have to deny myself and make myself an empty vessel so I can meet all your needs. I think this is what we classically have called codependency. The moving against, she called the movement towards mastery, or the expansive solution. And that is because we think if we're the best, if we're right all the time, if we're number one, then we're going to be loved and accepted. And the last one, the appeal of freedom, is the moving away from, and she called that the solution of resignation, that we just give up. So I want to talk about all three of these things, and I want to talk about how they resolve this anxiety, and how taking one of those three paths puts us to sleep. Because every path that we take puts us into a trance. And that's what Gurdjieff was so great at talking about. He says that we have to all realize that we're all asleep, dreaming that we're awake. But we cannot wake up with the information that put us into the trance at first. And this is where we need new information and new experience to start waking up. And sometimes that's really stimulated and evoked and provoked from pain. We talk about in the big book as hitting bottom. So let's take the appeal of love first, right? What she called moving towards. Well, this person resolves that anxiety about being loved and accepted because they believe that if they can just find someone to love them and that they can love, that their life is going to be okay. For this person, love carries a very, very magical quality to it. If you're able to find that special one, and this person will have fantasies about that, finding that, soulmate, finding that one person that's going to understand you, that's going to be there for you, that you're going to be able to make happy. And by making them happy and fulfilling all their needs, that you're going to be complete. So the desire to please overrides everything else, which means that we have to get rid of our own needs, because I can't be everything you need me to be if I have any needs myself. So remember, last time I talked about the fragmentation of our personality. Well, in this case, I have to deny my needs so that I can be available for yours. So I will become desensitized to my wants, and I will become hyper vigilant of what you want. I will know what you want before you even know it. Is the kind of thing that happens with this. I will anticipate everything. And if I fail you, I am going to feel a great deal of shame and anxiety. Because if you don't love me, there's going to be serious trouble in my life. It's going to provoke and reconnect me with all of that anxiety that happened originally that sent me off in this direction. So every relationship that we have, especially those that are significant and important to us, we have so much investment in them, and there's so much at risk. So it creates a tremendous amount of tension, especially if we end up out of sync with our partner. Now, the appeal of mastery, needing to be number one or moving against people, that person is not interested in loving, but in being loved and being admired. She called it the expansive solution. So it's the opposite. This person's needs are all important. Your needs are secondary. Your job is to love me and admire me and think that I'm great. If you have any needs, then I'm going to be, and you suggest that I'm wrong in some way, I'm going to flip it around and make it feel like you're failing me and that you shouldn't burden me with your feelings at all. Of course, it's all about me. This is the person that people typically refer to as the narcissist. And that expansive, solution can take some pretty ugly, paths. There's what she called the arrogant, vindictive type, which is the person that if you don't give me what I want, and if you don't admire me, then I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to make you wrong, and I'm going to make you pay and suffer. And there's another person that just wants to be right all the time. And if they're not, then they're just going to be humiliated. But with the arrogant, vindictive type, if you humiliate them, they will make you pay a price. And there's no fury like that of someone who's humiliated. That's the arrogant, vindictive type of this expansive solution. They are dangerous and they are scary. Now, this person denies any weakness in them because they have to be the best. They have to be the strongest. They have to be the smartest. So any part of this person that doesn't fit with that idealized image, with that blueprint of who they're supposed to be, is going to be rejected. They're not going to be able to admit when they're wrong. They're going to blame everybody else on how they screwed up. And that's why things didn't work out. The person that's the moving towards solution, that person's more than willing to admit they're wrong. In fact, they'll take responsibility for everything. This person takes responsibility for nothing. If only the world would listen to them, everything would be okay. In fact, Bill even writes about that in the big book about this solution. Now, we can see in terms of relationships, both of these solutions are fraught with all kinds of difficulties because there's no give and take, and the person that's moving towards the relationship is not based on a mutual sharing and giving and taking. The giving is in one direction. In the other relationship, it's all about taking with the person with the expansive solution. They take and they give very little, and they expect to be appreciated for whatever they do, regardless. Now, the third solution, the appeal for freedom, is very interesting. In this solution, the solution of resignation, the person gives up the idea that they can be satisfied and that life will work in any way. So they completely desensitize themselves of any needs or wants or desires. They will get rid of any kind of inner conflict. They will not experience it. They will not recognize an inner conflict. Those other two solutions we talked about, the expansive solution and the self-effacing solution, moving towards or moving against and moving towards, they're going to have conflict when things don't go a certain way. But the person who's resigned won't care. Their attitude, it doesn't matter. No big deal. There's no big deal for the person that's got their solution of resignation. And there's no motivation. There's no ambition. That person is not striving in any way. They just accept things as they are. Mediocrity is as good as it's going to get, and that's fine. It's foolish to be striving for more. Is that what that person thinks? So this person has put to sleep all those parts of themselves that wants them to move forward, to improve, to strive to be what they can be. There's no striving that takes place at all. There's just an attitude of resignation. And so in a relationship with this person there's nothing to get a hold of. I mean, on the weekends, the person will sit in front of the TV for 10 or 12 hours, and they'll be okay with that. They won't really want to do anything. Because after all, life is not about being satisfied. It's kind of tolerating it. So in every one of these cases, every path that we follow, and look, all of us can do all three of these things. And I'm not saying that any one of these things is inherently bad, because if you move towards people and you can also, not just give, but receive, moving towards is a good thing. Every one of these things becomes problematic when they're fixed. And see, that's the important thing to note. When they become fixed, they become compulsive. I must be this way. I don't have a choice. But in any one of these paths that I've described, if it's within our ability to turn it on and turn it off, then it can be a very adaptive mechanism in terms of being in the world. So please don't hear that these things are inherently bad. They get maladaptive when they become so fixed and compulsive. So wanting to do the best and be the best is a great thing, as long as you don't have to be. Wanting to please someone is wonderful, as long as it's a choice and not that you must do it. Not caring at times, that's okay too. Kick back, chill out, man. It's fine. But once again, any one of these things that becomes dominant in our life then becomes an issue for us. Now, when we start to wake up, we wake up and we start to see these patterns to our behavior. That's what Ernie Larson said. Stage 2 recovery is about becoming aware of those patterns and habits that are controlling our life. Freud said it a different way. He says we've got to become aware of the forces that are living us. Not that we're living, but that are determining our behavior. In every one of these solutions, we have lost the ability to be sincere with ourselves, that we've cut ourselves so much off from our true self that we've lost the ability to be sincere with ourselves, that we are no longer a determining force in our lives. It's the tail is wagging the dog, so to speak, is what's happening here. So one of the ways that you can start looking at this is make a list of your shoulds. I should be this way. I should be that way. Just say I should, and then start doing an incomplete sentences. Say I should, and then the first thing that comes into mind, write it down. Do it again. I should. And if you keep doing it, you're going to start to see that these shoulds take the form of some kind of a configuration, and you're going to see a pattern to it. And the pattern is going to really cluster around one of these three factors I just talked about. That's one way you can get a sense of which of these three directions that you took your life to try to solve that basic anxiety. As we start to investigate this, as we bring curiosity to ourselves, we start to wake up and we start to see certain patterns and certain things in our life. And we will be getting into that, next week when we start to talk about the second essential insight for emotional sobriety. But enough said about that tonight. Let me invite Roger and Herb in, and Tom. Since Tom Rutledge is not here, why don't you also join us tonight, and see if you'd like to make any comments to this.
Good evening, Alan, and thank you. Hi, Tom. Hey, Herb. I'm willing to kick it off if that's okay with you guys.
Please, yeah, of course.
Well, first of all, thank you, Alan. In talking about Karen Horney's work, because you've been such a student of her work for so many decades of your life, I just love how you bring additional richness and depth to her descriptions of those three styles that goes well beyond what you talk about in your chapter in the book. And I really appreciate that. A few things that I jotted down. You had worded it as, how did you say it exactly? Oops, that's That's from last week when I was watching your lecture from last week today. Um, yeah, you had said we go through a period, most of us, where we experience this basic anxiety. And for some of us, that period is called our entire life. I just wanted to make that point.
That's
Okay,
true.
for
Very
for
true.
if we had what's called an insecure attachment or a poor attachment to a caregiver, we never formed a secure attachment, and I would argue that most of us never did because for many reasons. First of all, most of our parents and their parents before them never did, and secondly, much more is understood now about the importance of, as you were saying last week in your example, about the orphans, right?
Yeah.
The importance of holding, physical holding and touch, the importance of eye contact, the importance of active engagement, or even quiet connection between caregiver and infant, caregiver and toddler, caregiver and young child. Just a lot has been discovered about that. It's interesting, discovered in a certain scientific sense in what we view as many primitive societies who tend to carry their infants with them all day when they're out doing their labors, right? It's just it's understood that physical contact and connection are incredibly important for what? For not only making the infant or toddler feel more secure, but for them to be able to gradually internalize that sense of safety and security. I sometimes think that the point of our lives is to become aware of and repair as much of our sources of pain as we can, because it's so common from my perspective, looking within myself and also at almost everyone I see around me, that I guess I try to make sense of that by saying, well, maybe that is, in a certain sense, a part of our purpose here. Sometimes I think of it as learning to value and love ourselves. I also think of that as one of our most, perhaps our greatest challenge for many of us in the course of our lives. But it's kind of comforting to me if I think I feel less kind of despairing and less depressed and less hopeless if I have a point of view that says, we're all in the same boat. As you and I have talked about, Alan, the degree matters and the degree varies incredibly. But to one degree or another, none of us, come out of our childhoods fully formed, fully secure, fully enlightened beings, right? We all struggle. But as you and Herb and have said so often, it's out of that struggle, it's out of our trouble that so much of our growth can emerge. Several other things. The style of moving toward, another word we use for that is placating at times, right? In terms of more like Virginia Satir, I believe her orientation. And I wanted to mention that there's one time where the feelings of me, if I'm trying to placate someone because I'm fearful or insecure around them, or I see others, there's one time where I will be very aware of my own feelings. And that's if the person I'm trying to placate doesn't fulfill their end of the bargain, a bargain which they, in all likelihood, don't realize they ever made with me, which is if I'm going to submerge myself and, erase myself in the context of our relationship, you'd better come through with the goods, right? You better give me the consistent love and so on that I want. And the problem I've seen is in many of those kinds of relationships, eventually the person I've been counting on to give me love will eventually tire of my dependency in the relationship, however much they might love all the attention to begin with and then be in the center of my universe. Eventually it tends to wear thin. And the other thing that tends to wear thin with all three of these styles, one of the basic things we do when we feel unsafe and insecure is what? Well, we try to exert additional control over the people around us, the situations we are in, the events that are likely or unlikely to occur.
Yep.
That's what we all go to, and it's very understandable as a way of trying to protect ourselves and take care of ourselves. But in all three of these styles, that those efforts of control are another whole way to look at them and to begin to describe what can begin to go wrong quite quickly, or sometimes after decades, right? In each of these three styles. Those are a couple of high points. I'd love to hear what Herb.
Let me just elaborate on a couple things that you said, Raj, and I really appreciate, first of all, the emphasis on the control, because every one of those strategies is based on trying to control our experience and the outcome of our interactions with people.
Yeah.
So you're right on, man. That is such a powerful, motive that moves us. The anxiety really moves us towards wanting to be controlling and to control our experience. So that's one thing. Yeah. The other thing I was just reading earlier tonight when I was going back over and looking at some of her work is she made a real strong point, is that even though some of these anxieties start in our experience as infants, is they have an adult version to them. And it's not just that an infantile manifestation of that basic anxiety, that we adopt now a current contemporary version of that is related to the infantile experiences, but has its own texture to it. Because now, like when I did the first thing about the different states of consciousness we have, right? Is that as we mature cognitively, we experience the world differently. So, of course, the anxiety is going to have more meaning at 30 years old than it's going to have at 5 years old. And that was a very important point she made. She says, because you cannot just understand an anxiety from what you experienced as a child, you have to also understand how you're experiencing it now as an adult, which I thought was brilliant insight on her part. Yeah, great. Okay, cool, man. Thank you.
Sure.
Herb? Mr. Caden.
I'm Herb. I'm an alcoholic.
I heard you, alcoholic. You.
Yeah, really. No, it's wonderful. Alan, your talk was just so rich, and there's so much there, and I've made a lot of connections and a lot of suspicions of connections. Yeah, well, the first note I made was, as you were talking, I could see that safety is like the bullseye. Yeah. We want to survive. But when I'm young, meaning under 30, I get my survival safety kinds from the outside.
Yeah.
I want to be safe from, safe from other people, safe from life. I make up a story about God. It's all other, and this whole thing we're doing as emotional sobriety is where we're taking it after age 30, probably at least, we're taking it inside and establishing the safety from our own relationships with ourselves and with life and with others and with whatever story it is we're going to make up about reality itself. So it's like that whole safety is the dynamic from the outside to the inside. But I also related and I've read Karen Horney's book at your recommendation. It's just wonderful. Now I will reread it 20 years later. But anyway, it seemed to be very correlated with what Bill Wilson talks about in step 4 in the 12 and 12 about instincts. Yeah. Fight, flight, and freeze. And it's not a direct correlation, but I also related that, as you know, from my prior discussions with the way our brain is structured in terms of the brainstem and the limbic system and the cortex. And I know there's all kinds of correlations there. I don't know exactly what they are and how they operate, but I'd like to understand structure and how things work, because then it explains behavior and perhaps how to be healthy. one of the tools that's really helped me, and I'm just going to introduce the word, not give any type of explanation, is the Enneagram. The Enneagram is a study of personality based on those three dynamics of fight, flight, and freeze. As all people have all of that, and I'm thinking correlated with the brain structure itself, and that some of us have a dominant anger, some of us have a dominant fear, some of us have a dominant shame, but it so correlated with the toward and against and away from,
Yeah.
with some manipulation, but I think everybody's kind of like seeing the same, like our behavior comes from our structure, and our structure is what it is, and there's an emphasis in each of us. Each of us has all of it, but each of us has a particular personality constellation based on genetics and our experience. And this is what we're talking about here. I'm not sure what all that means.
But
but it helps me attempting to understand and then to attempt to communicate. So how can we live in you used that term, Alan, way back when, optimal living. And that is really understanding and cooperating with how we're built, how each of us is built.
Well, thank you, Herb. And I want to add one thing. If you add the fourth F to fight, flight, or freeze, and one of our people in the meeting did a couple of weeks ago, which is fawn.
I don't like it. I don't like it at all. I think it's cute and new agey, and I think
no.
It's a
okay.
It's a
hate that, Ben. No, yeah. I see it quite differently, because I see fawn, but to me that lines up very well with codependency behavior. So see, I see it somewhat differently than you do. So I see that as to me, these all, and that's the point Alan was making, and I was making with regard to controlling behavior, these are all manipulations at a certain level in the way that Horney talks about them. And I think fawn is sufficiently different from the other three that it's a worthwhile fourth identification of a fourth strategy. So that's my perspective. Yep. There was one other point I wanted to make, but I'd love to hear what you have to say, Tom.
So, I appreciate all the comments so far. And, if I look at the three reactions, the three responses, I immediately go, well, I went with resignation, right? I went with, giving up, right? That was essentially that I'm not important. This isn't important, that black hole. But then, as I, hear the others described, I'm like, oh, I've actually picked and choose, maybe not consciously, but I've, started to work the others in different situations and relationships where I thought that, it would, help me survive, and get by. So while I'm heavily on the resignation side, or was, there's a bit of bouncing between them. Does that make sense, Alan?
Well, as Roger just said, it's all about manipulation.
Yeah,
so
right.
that we can survive.
Right.
So we can survive. That's right, Herb. That's right.
Right.
I had
go ahead, Tom.
I had a deep conversation. They're all deep, actually, but conversation in my meditation book group last week. We were talking about Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Voice of Knowledge, and secondary characters. And how we don't really know what the other people, how they see themselves and how they see us, and I started talking about my relationship with my mother, and in that moment I was saying, like, how upsetting it was for me to realize that I was just a secondary character for my mother, even though she demonstrated that by not caring for me in a lot of ways. Right? She was an alcoholic and a depressive, and ran off with her boyfriend, and so like, that's where my safety net just kind of fell away, and my foundation crumbled. But there was still this fantasy, this story I told myself that, one day I'll get my mom back, and that will then replace the foundation that I needed. And so I, disregarding whatever she needed or was searching for, lacking in her own life that sent her on that journey, I was putting this, demand on her and this story on her. And then later on, she got sober, which was one of my biggest hopes. 10 years into the program, I took her to her first meeting and she stayed sober. And that's wonderful for her, but it still didn't solve that story that I had, that I needed this version of this person in my life, that I need my mommy back, to make me whole. It was a completely different version of a mom, right? An adult relationship, sober relationship, son to daughter, son to mother, and it was very rewarding in that way. But it was almost like losing my mom twice, right? But that realization really, like, catapulted me, right? Because I realized it was all demands, and it was all, I was hinging my, safety, security on that relationship and what was happening with, her results. And, I had the friend, when I was having this conversation with, that she said, was it worth it? Would you change it? And I didn't have an answer, because I wouldn't be here now, right? There's an alternate version of Tom somewhere else who's had that experience, but this is wonderful. This experience right here now is wonderful, and I got to learn a lot along the way.
That point that's what I was trying to say, but you said it much better, I think, Tom. That to me is what I was trying to say by pointing out that we all arrive at adulthood with varying degrees of woundedness, right? Varying degrees of injury, but it's in the working out of and becoming aware of those injuries that we become who we are. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
I would have never. No, I won't say never. I had an opportunity to wake up from that dream I had, that story I had about the way my mom was supposed to be, my dad, and how my life was supposed to turn out. So we go back to the idea of we need to wake up first, and then the journey begins. There's where it hit me.
Yeah.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see, that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.